Welcome to Chapter 6. This chapter is the beginning of the exploration in the book on mediums. So we went through already trying to figure out, okay, well, why is art made? What is this art thing? How can we really define it? And now we're saying, well, what are the materials really that encompass the majority of art making? How do we categorize those? So we go over these mediums so that way when you're talking about this in your papers or your assignments or even just regular conversation in a gallery museum, like you'll understand what those titles mean, those little placards next to the piece that list all that information, and really what is the difference between the mediums. So just like in the Elements and Principles chapters where we started with line, well, within medium, you know, no matter what you do, whether you're an architect or you are a painter, or you usually start with a drawing of some sort, right? There's this idea that the drawing is sort of the beginning of sort of collecting one's thoughts. So what does it really mean then to be a drawing, and what can a drawing be really made of, right? If we think about that, I've seen in my own artistic career where I've seen drawings that are three-dimensional, right? Just using wire, and somebody's sort of just like playing around with the wire to sort of figure out what they want to do that would still be represented three-dimensionally, but this thing is kind of like a three-dimensional sketch, right? We think of our sketchbooks. We think of even writing down notes during class, right? All those I'd consider like a part of a drawing, right? This collection of ideas. Now, drawing itself was never really considered a fine art for a long period of time. Drawing historically has been used specifically as preparatory. So when you look at earlier drawings, all those would have been used in lieu of getting to the painting or the sculpture and such. And more recently, have we really, and we're talking like late 1800s or so, used drawing as the medium itself to say, this is the final piece. So let's take a look a little bit at drawing. All right, what's in a drawing, right? We all know that everyone draws in some capacity. You may say, well, I don't draw well, or some say, oh, I don't like drawing. But in any capacity, we all draw, right? We all make marks on a surface. It's really this beginning of our mark making that has refined itself into the alphabet, the recorded history, playful activities, and fine art, right? So all this idea of even just taking your finger and drawing in the sand, right? This delineation of the real world into your sort of interpretation of it can be considered drawing, right? Drawing may be the last remnant of our youth or childhood that we carry. So I throw this in here because there's something innate about us just drawing, right? Just sitting there and drawing, whether you're in a lecture course or even right now listening to this lecture, just doodling to it, that's fine. There's the way I grew up in a church, I feel like that's where I learned how to draw, because I would sit in the pew and draw on all the little offering placard cards, right? It wasn't that I wasn't paying attention, but it actually kind of helped me hear more, collectively understand what is going on around me as I drew, and did that my entire childhood. So drawing we can talk about as a sketch. We can talk about it as a process, the final work. Sometimes we use the term cartoon. This is not necessarily in reference to ideas of small little graphics in the Sunday paper or comic books and stuff, but a cartoon was the first drawings that a lot of masters and mural painters would use, and then they would use a process where they would puncture holes in the drawing itself, and then transfer that via like charcoal and stuff to the walls itself, so they knew where they needed to paint. So the cartoon was more of that first step into then tracing it onto the walls. We could talk prepping, jotting down ideas, and the list goes on. All people use some form of drawing to record, categorize, organize, and work in their daily life, right? It is us. And drawing can be done in a variety of mediums, and we're going to explore those. And those are considered both wet and dry mediums, which will be pretty self-explanatory when we look at them. I love this piece on the right, just an example of not only what you can do with a pencil, but like all those different types of marks that can be put into a drawing. There's something about drawing that's so quick and so innate that it can be layered, right? It can be controlled. It can be as expressive as you want it to be. And there's something that's almost a dumbing down of all of our processes when we draw. It just feels so instinctual. All right. Well, before drawing, let's talk a little bit about some history here. And I put this link in there because it's kind of cool to see how paper was made. Um, before it was invented, we had to draw on something else, and we've seen that within cave walls. You can think about on the sides of pottery. Uh, Even in sort of an engraving into a rock, or putting those marks into a piece of wood, all those sort of things you could think about as sort of a drawing like process. Older materials like stone, wood, and clay and pottery gave way to newer inventions, though, and we know these as like parchment, Egyptian papyrus, vellum, which is goat skin primarily, stretched, and it's fairly thin, but vellum itself, we use a synthetic version now, but most of your early books were made of vellum, and that's why they still hold today. They won't disintegrate, right? And even silk was used as a surface to draw on. But paper, as we know it, not like Egyptian papyrus, but paper is invented in China and adopted around the world as it becomes one of its sort of hidden secrets, but trade goods. And so their form of paper really, following the Silk Road, sort of spreads out across the world, and its techniques are then mimicked and copied to realize like what we can do with this substance. And because it is readily available or readily made. If you've ever made paper before, you can make it, of course, traditionally through the pulping of wood or of other organic materials. I've seen people use onion skins. I've seen people use mulberry leaves. Any sort of organic material can be sort of mashed down and made into a paper at some level. Now there's different sort of grades and thicknesses and things like that, but under conditions that are very controlled, right? You can create lots of different types of paper, and so when this is adopted, this is pretty versatile for the world because now we can make it pretty inexpensively. People can do this anywhere, and from there, that's why we're able to start seeing more mass production of books. We see more education. We see a more sort of democratized way of writing that comes around. So a lot of that is owed to the Chinese and the use of paper. All right, so let's talk about some of these dry mediums in drawing. Okay, dry media is probably the most common in our daily lives, right? And there's a lot of varieties, but the basis of any of this, and it'll even continue into painting, like in order for us to make a mark, in order for that material to work, right, we have to have the pigment and a binder for them, in mixing that together in order for us to create sort of a stick or something to hold to create some of these dry mediums. Now the pigment is usually a natural color. We have some synthetic colors now that we use more, but primarily was a natural occurring material. Ochres and things like berries and all that, would have been crushed down and then added with a binder, right? And this binder is there's a variety. We've in ancient times for cave paintings, they use saliva, and so you could put the pigment in the mouth, crush it, by biting it and sort of like just rolling it around in your tongue, and then using your mouth like a spray paint, like an air, and just spraying it out over there, and using the hand as the stencil. And we see that, but that saliva will help as a binder to bind it to the surface, right? Because if you guys have ever noticed, like if you take a piece of chalk, right, and that chalk is then just quickly drawn onto a surface, right, it's pretty easy to just come up and brush it away, right? Like the materials themselves, need something. So that's why we use different wet dry mediums, but also the medium itself, it just does not have a way to stick, not only together but on the surface. So primarily we use gum arabic now, gum arabic is actually used in chewing gum, and you can even see a little bit of it on the right there in the hands in this image here, right? We see a bunch of gum arabic, which is just added with water, and it easily dissolves down, and then you can add it to any sort of food stuff or yeah, like the pigments that you see also there in the photo. All right, so graphite, probably the most common, most familiar graphite. We sometimes call this lead, like, oh, where's your lead pencil? Well, it's not lead, okay? Pencils are created from graphite mixed with amounts of clay. And I even use it there. The more the clay, the harder the lead, which really is the harder the graphite, right? It's a combination of two. Graphite is a common material that's very, very soft. And so by taking clay and mixing it with powdered graphite, you are able to control sort of a mixture, right? If you had like a 50-50 mixture, you would get something that we call HB, right? Which is the equal amounts of hard to equal amounts of soft. And I put that right here. If you ever look at the end of your pencil, your regular pencil, you'll see that it has an H or a B or a combination of both. So if you have an H, meaning hard, it has more clay than graphite in it, and it should make a light line. And if you have a 2H or a 3H or 4H, and as you go up, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter as more clay is added. Now, on the opposite end, B, being soft, means there's more graphite than clay. And as we climb in numbers from a B to a 2B, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 9B, that's where you have more and more graphite, meaning that line's going to get darker. So that's why we have a variety of pencils as artists. So that way we're not pushing as hard as we need to. We just change the pencil to get more graphite on the surface in order to create those lighter or darker marks of our choosing. All right, metal point. This is a pretty interesting dry medium. It's pretty archaic, and we don't really see it at all anymore. A lot of time known as silver point. And the idea of this is that a piece of silver, or in this case, sometimes even a piece of metal, is sharpened down to a point. So you can see that here where the stylus, or which we think of like as a pencil. Pencil is considered like a stylus, right? Anything that's sharpened to a point that allows us to make a mark as a stylus. And that point now is going to stay that sharp. So what's nice about a metal point drawing is that the lines are usually super fine, sometimes even the width of a hair, and really, really beautiful. But when you make the mark on the surface, it takes time for it to oxidize in order for us to see it. So, it starts off fairly light gray, but as time goes on, it'll get darker and darker and darker as that metal that is left on the surface of the paper oxidizes. So you use definitely soft metals. That's why silver is used in this. So that way, when the stylus is brought across the surface, it's just leaving little remnants, right? It's just kind of a little bit of a mark is left in those fibers that'll change it over time. But we don't really use that as much anymore. It's not very common at all. Now, charcoal. Charcoal is another basic medium that's been used for a long, long time, probably even historically more prevalent than something like graphite. We've been manufacturing it for a while, but of course it's also sort of a natural material that is left over from most campfires and stuff. So it's pretty easy for anybody to get their hands on it and start making marks with it. Anybody who has a young kid probably has instinctually like turned their back for too long and found their kid grabbing something that would instinctually make a mark really quickly, and they've already made 1,000 marks all over the walls by the time you turn back around. But charcoal is now manufactured in a way where before you'd have during the Renaissance, to make it, there would be harvests of grapevines and things like that, and they take all the grapes off. Well, you could burn and then quickly cover. Once you caught all those vines on fire in a pile, you quickly cover it with dirt and let the air, you're trying to control the air, right? And you kind of make an oven over this thing by covering it. Anytime you see a little smoke come out, you cover that with more dirt, and you usually leave it there for several days. And And when you start then digging through it after a few days, you find that all the pure organic form has been burnt away, but it's left a nice carbon structure, right? And that's why we call it vine charcoal. Is that was how it was created earlier in times, and so you'd sort of maximize the materials, nothing would go to waste, and then you kind of go through all the dirt and you find all these pieces of charcoal. Willow charcoal is also predominantly used, and it's really nice because it leaves a nice bold dark mark right off the bat. Um, Modern versions allows for it to be made into like pencils, and sometimes we crush it and recompress it with a binder to make it really, really intense black. You can get different weights in it, just like a pencil. But a lot of artists like it because, as you can see on the image on the right, just how bold of a mark it is. It's something that feels natural and organic. It has a greater tendency to be blended and feel more natural, where graphite takes a little bit more effort to do that and even has more control to it. But charcoal itself is a very expressive medium and is almost more like painting in many regards because you're using this thicker stick that leaves, a very specific type of line. All right, another of the dry mediums, we'll talk a little bit more about color, right? It basically is colored charcoal in many regards, but this is crayons, pastels, and chalk. These are usually always associated with color. And the color pigments are mixed with gum arabic, wax, or grease. And those binders create for us soft pastels, crayons, oil pastels. And so depending on what you're looking for, I'm sure a lot of you have played with colored chalk. That's what a pastel would be considered, is a colored chalk. Crayon, of course, we know that as the wax binder, and crayons themselves were actually more expensive when they were first sort of came about and created, because you can imagine just the labor that would go into gathering the wax and then melting the wax and then adding the pigment to the wax. And pigments are pretty expensive. Painters painted thin layers for very specific reasons, to maximize the cost that they spent on that pigment, but then, to be able to paint longer with it. So wax crayons were pretty expensive when they first were invented. And then oil pastels, or sometimes grease markers and things like that, right? You use that oil or linseed oil to bind that dry pigment together, and it leaves more of like a smearing, so if you made a mark with an oil pastel, you can take your fingers and move it around, and it will end up looking more like paint on the surface, where pastel will look more like a charcoal drawing on the surface, since it's all dry. All right, liquid mediums in drawing. Liquid mediums they're going to use the same pigments and binders as the dry mediums, but are now applied before the material can actually harden. So we're suspending all that pigment in sort of a liquid variation, sometimes water, sometimes alcohol, and then after it's applied and all of that evaporates, it leaves that pigment sort of embedded, soaked into the surface of like a paper or canvas. More mediums today are finding dual applications for wet and dry medium, and I list there like watercolor pencils. So you can take a watercolor pencil and it's a dry medium at first, and you can draw with it, and then you can take and add water to it to make more different like effects, and then let it dry. So you have these combinations, that new materials that have been invented, and there really is not a whole lot different. And of course, the most popular being pen and ink. We take the same black pigments that would have been used for making charcoal or compressed charcoal and such, and just liquefying those down. And like the Chinese, they have a brick of black pigment, and what they will do is sort of put a little tray out, put some water in there, and they will take the black pigment rock, it looks like a slab, and they can rub it on that stone and sort of like slowly release the desired amount of pigment into the ink that they're using, that then can then be brushed. And so you have that. We have it in jars or pen nibs like you see here. Like it's a traditional pen nib, or in calligraphy pens will have those same sort of nibs. and you can, sort of dip and then make that mark. And the ink is made to flow through a small channel in the split of that metal there. And so you're able to control that for a little bit of time. Now we think of like ballpoint pens and things like that have that cartridge that allows just to keep writing without having to refill. But paper and collage as a medium of drawing, right? Some people, and Romare Bearden is a great example here, and the YouTube link will tell you more about his life. But, instead of trying to draw out the images, using the materials that are around you to sort of create a drawing, right? Using paste and, getting that down and stuck to a page and building layers, right? It's still that same collaging of ideas that you can do with a graphite pencil. This just allows it to be a little bit more suited to what the artist is desiring. Many artists choose to, these images are already made because they don't need to make up new ones, or they've already have sort of a treasure trove of what they want to work with. So you can use that. All right, painting, chapter 7. Painting's pretty great because it is applicable to every culture. It is applicable to anybody who's just sort of wants to jump in on the art scene, and it can be done in color, it can be done black and white, and painting's just a beautiful thing. Now, here's everybody's favorite painter, right? Everybody loves Bob Ross, and may he rest in peace. But painting has been used for centuries to give some of the greatest insight to cultural history. It was the medium that had more pigments available to it, and has probably seen the most technological advancements of medium as it's moved through the history of time. I say that it's primarily driven by color because usually people of color that love color just love using painting as a source. So it's an application across every culture, like I'd said before, and can cover a variety of surfaces. So it's a really flexible medium to use. And we'll talk about it just like we did with the wet and dry states. So one of the earliest forms, because we have to think about painting just didn't happen. Cave painting started with saliva as the binder. As time moves on, there's other things that are found and created, and the next would have to be encaustic. And encaustic is utilizing wax, and warm wax or melted wax. We do add a little bit of resin mixture to sort of keep it in a liquid state for a while, but you can imagine how hard it is to work in a medium that wants to dry so quickly. But what's beautiful about encaustic is, so you're heating the wax, you're mixing in a little bit of resin, usually, which is tree sap that's been crushed down really, really fine, and sort of distilled in this, and then adding in a pigment. And that pigment, all of that is now encased. So when that wax does cool down and seals, there's no air that's going to get to that pigment. It has sort of like already a protective shell to it in many ways. And so encaustic paintings are very well preserved. And their colors are very vivid, where we could, if you've ever gone to, like, let's say like a Goodwill, and you happen to like look through for a frame, and you'll see paintings like our contemporary watercolors, stuff that you can tell we're in the sun, right? They've been bleached. Or if you've walked around downtown and you see like somebody's decorations and they've been in the window so long that it's just been bleached by the sun. Well, encaustic paintings won't really have a whole lot of that because of that protective coating over it, and that pigment, that binder is locked in and sealed. This technique actually was lost for several centuries and then rediscovered, and now a lot of contemporary artists even still use this in some way. So I show a little bit of the steps there for you. Another early form was fresco painting. This is a technique of painting that utilizes pigments in and on plaster. So we're going to talk about the two differences here in a sec. Fresco secco, and the term is listed there for you. This is when the plaster is applied to a wall that plaster is then drying, and then the paint is added to the surface. So if you imagine, somebody comes in and stuccos the entire wall, and then after it's dry, the painter comes in and starts drawing on it and then adding the scene, and you can sort of take your time, and everything is not as a rushed process. The problem with that is my analogy earlier with the whole pastel on the sidewalk, and it can just be wiped away. Well, the pigment is not really binding to the surface of that plaster. The plaster is dried, so it's not receiving it doesn't want to receive anything else. So that paint is just sort of hovering on the surface, and a lot of these frescoes are susceptible to damage and just decay over time. Where something like buon fresco, or known as true fresco, it'll be done in stages where wet plaster is applied, right? So the artist needs to have a lot of steps already planned out where wet plaster is applied, and then while that plaster is wet, the painting begins. And so that way, that just kind of like how watercolor soaks in the paper, that's what this pigment is doing. It's soaking into the surface, and then when it dries, it's sealed and it's encased. And therefore, it's not susceptible to air as much anymore. It can't just flake off. We've all seen, people have to paint their houses all the time because that paint is not really binding to the wood, and it just flakes off. So that's the difference. And then the cartoon, we've talked about this term before, and I just use it again here, as to reference the drawing that's applied to the plaster wall, and they use this as stencil to paint from. So here's those steps. Here's that cartoon that we see, right, where on a regular wall, and we can even see that over here where that cartooning has already been applied, right? It's sort of a basic. We notice that there's not a whole lot. It's more just the contour lines. And what then the artist is doing, right, is applying areas of wet plaster, right? So here's step one, right? Here's step two. We've added in that wet plaster and started painting in there, right? And then step 3 and 4, right? We can see where we continue to grow, and right here, of course, we have the reference of it, so we know what colors we're going to do. But just to sort of stay in that lines and keep painting into that surface, and then when it's all dried, now that thing is going to be permanent. And this became the more proper technique to use, especially during the Renaissance. And if you went and saw frescoes, even contemporary frescoes, this is how they're going to do them. So this will give you sort of an idea of the steps. Very labor intensive, and either you're having an assistant put that plaster on, or the artist is doing it themselves because they may want to control that plaster. Some artists would even build up and model the plaster in sort of a relief, so the form felt somewhat three-dimensionally before it was painted. So each artist has their own sort of techniques. Tempera painting. Tempera is pretty interesting. It gains its popularity before the discovery of the last two that we'll talk about. And what it does is also allows for a lot of vivid color and a lot of preservation of the color, because they're using egg yolk as the binder. And if anybody's ever, cooked an egg in the morning and then just let that pan set and then try to clean it later, or on a plate, let's say you just over easy your egg, or sunny side your egg, that sort of thing. And then you break that yolk, and there's that little bit of yolk left over, and it's sitting there in the sink, didn't get washed. And then you go to wash it. You really got to scrub that thing, right? That egg yolk, pretty sticky, and really, really is a great binder. So what you do is you separate the whites and get a yolk out. It's almost like baking, right? And then once you have just the yolk, right, you can cut the sack of the yolk. Usually you can hold it by your fingers and take an X-Acto knife. This is what we did in school. And just kind of just prick the sack so just a little bit of the yolk comes out, and the rest can sort of be contained in there. And then you take that little bit of yolk and you add in a little bit of water and then some pigments, and so the water helps it just not dry so quickly, because you can imagine it will want to dry very, very quickly, especially in environments that are dry climates. And then you can go ahead and start painting with that. Now, of course, the problem is that you can't do up a bunch of paint right? It's not going to sit overnight, so you don't want to waste all your paint. So you're doing this in small amounts. So you better know really quickly all your colors ahead of time. This also needed a coat of what was called gesso. And gesso became the material, which is white and is usually like a gypsum, which is the same material that you find in like sheetrock. And this gypsum would be liquefied and then put down, and gesso allows for uh, a surface something like canvas, which would have fibers, and those fibers are, if you think of your clothes and how they wear out over time, well, canvas would too, if if it was worked again and again and again. So if we put a coat of gesso over there, not only do those fibers get a little bit more strength and rigidity, but now if I add paint to it, they're not just going to flake off over time. They're not just going to fall off, right? So gesso becomes a really important step for us. And so we add that because canvas is actually being starting to become more manufactured. Before, paintings were traditionally just done on wood panels, on hardwood panels specifically, and those woods would be very specific to the regions that they were. Uh, like Italy would have different panels than Germany, right? That type of wood. I think lime wood was one of the more popular to use up in Germany, and so those hard woods became really important because they wouldn't warp or something. But you can imagine them being heavier, harder to sort of work on, need more prep. And so when canvas starts to be produced more commonly, we see that in the Renaissance, people are able to now start painting a lot bigger. And that's why our paintings get so monumental in scale, because our technology is allowing for artists to have more readily available materials. All right. One of the, not the newest form of painting, but definitely one that's not really that old when we think about it in the history of art, is oil painting. Oil painting really caught on because, as you could tell with the other ones, they dried quickly or more labor intensive. Oil allowed the artists to really take their time. It allowed them to mix up even more colors because they're working in larger scale. This becomes really popular in the 15th century and replaced tempera as the main medium of painting. Right, and even today, people would probably still say that oils are still the most considered fine of the fine art mediums of painting. Acrylics definitely have their place, but a lot of painters will still just use oils. And this pigment would be suspended in usually boiled linseed oil. There's different levels of boiled linseed oil that you can make, but linseed oil, poppy seed, or walnut oil, and we still use these same oils to create different sort of shines, different sorts of layering of the colors. And what they're doing, since they're allowed to work slow, is that they're making what's called glazes, right? Same as when you think of donuts, right? This is a thin layer of oil paint. So what they're doing is they're putting a lot of the linseed oil or poppy seed oil, right? A lot of the oil compared to pigment, and making it more like watercolory in its consistency, and just slightly doing these layers upon layers. And that's how we're able to get the change in colors here, right? Or the way the light will reflect. And right here's a great example of layering, right? We have a lot of dark paint. This whole thing was painted dark. But then just right here in these areas, glazing is added in small increment steps to make us feel like, oh, he's got like a crushed velvet coat on, right? And we can see a little bit of that color bouncing off of this man's hat, you know. Now, with the other mediums, and specifically for wet or watercolor and gouache, if you were to go to an art supply store and look at these, you would say, well, what really is the difference? And watercolor it was always historically used for sketching because it could be done outside. Painting outside is also one of the sort of newer things that artists have done in sort of history of art. But it had a lot of translucent layers, right? It's just using water to break those down, and it would take a lot of, if you've ever had those Crayola sets, right, it takes a lot of the pigment to really create a dark mark. So because of that, we also then have something like gouache. And so when you look at the difference between these two paintings, right, the one looks very like light and iridescent, and then this looks dark. And that's because gouache is a little bit more like a stain to me, right? It's still applied and works just like watercolor, except there's just a heavier amount of pigment in those tubes of paint or in those bricks of paint. So when you squeeze it out, you're getting a heavier dose. So even though you're adding a little bit of water, you can really make these nice saturated colors on the page. The newest in the whole scheme of painting would be acrylics. And acrylics were created actually during World War II. They were made by the military for the use of being able to create a water impermeable layer quickly. And so the idea is that, if you could paint acrylic on anything, let it dry, all of a sudden now it would be able to repel water. So this became a pretty good material for flexibility in the battlefield and stuff. So that's where it kind of came from, actually, or its invention. But from there they realized, well, through it, this synthetic binder, you could also hold any sort of pigment, so you could change the color, and it becomes almost like like water-based in ways where it'll just dry to the air. We don't need oil to clean it up, right? It becomes a little less messy. It allows us to fabricate a lot more colors that don't exist in nature, and it comes from these synthetic pigments being suspended in this resin, and it really catches on, right? If you don't have ventilation, or maybe you're susceptible to smells or whatever it may be, right? Acrylic's a great option. And it's pretty interesting because you can really, really layer this stuff up. And I use the term impasto there, which has been done in oil paintings as well. But really with acrylic, you can do even more, where you're adding thick layers of paint to the surface. And it's just allowing it to be gobbed. So it almost takes on a relief and three-dimensional aspect. But acrylics themselves are very, very useful and flexible. Now, painting is always being challenged, and so to talk a little bit about where we're moving to with painting, and I would give some examples. So like in the 60s, instead of worrying about paint brushes and even canvas, right, you're just throwing it on the floor, right, and letting those colors run and drip sort of in a spontaneous nature. And then we also have on the right, and I want you to watch the Art 21 film. It's in season 7, and it's under her name, Katharina Gross, and you see how she's using moving in actual dirt and materials. In here, she's using styrofoam as well and carving that and then painting over it, right? And so she's technically painting a landscape, but is truly painting a landscape, right? She's moving all that stuff inside the museum, all the dirt, all the materials, and paint, and having these painted materials, so it mimics a landscape that she has painted. It's kind of maybe even a pun there. All right. Mosaics. So this is, of course, very traditional, but it's still being done today. And mosaic, you can consider like painting, even a little bit like drawing. And you're using what's called tessera, these small tiles, usually created in ceramic or in glass. And these are placed simultaneously next to one another in a controlled fashion to create patterns. We all know what mosaics are. Some are big tiles, some are small. You can change them up. And I give sort of 2 examples of how it's done. But you can see that hammer and that small metal, not really sharp to the point, right? But that's how they're able to cut those tiles down and control their sizes, and by purposely breaking them where you want them to be. And then you'll be able to put them next to one another. This was very, very common, especially for large scale before things like oil and could be done, especially in these higher domed areas where it was really hard to get somebody up there to do something like a true fresco. So mosaics, we still see them here and there. And tapestries. Tapestries are very traditional, and I show a contemporary look at them here, where we're a technique of using patterns and designs and create images out of cloth. These, of course, are usually made to hang, and were popular for their large scale since canvas hadn't been invented yet. So it was one way of working. And masters would have a lot of their paintings, small paintings, then redone in tapestries. We even have examples of Raphael and such that were made for the Sistine Chapel that were massive tapestries done from his drawings. So what this is based off is the idea of a warp and a weft, right? The warp is the strings held by the loom or the machine that run up and down, right? So it would be, you'd have warp, a lot of strings running this way out of these teeth right here, and the weft are strings that are ran through. So when this is separated, or you do it by hand with like what we see there's a needles, you could run a shuttle back and forth underneath this, as this thing is sort of like clamshelled back together again and again and again, and it would pack in and create what we see down here, sort of that design and pattern. Now, the contemporary example that is in the image is all done digitally, right? This is a tapestry machine that is all run by a computer and can adjust to any color and any variation it needs. So, I mean, quite beautiful to see this such beautiful rendition of just smoke blowing around on the tapestry. But it's a loom that's controlled by a computer that's doing that. Well, that's our first introduction to some of the mediums. We're going to continue mediums as we move through other chapters.